Hello, everybody. My name is mfaust1045. It's my handle. And this is going to be a hopefully short presentation about ontological mathematics and how it compares, how you can think of it as a Linux distribution. Before I get started, I should say that I'm not going to spend very much time talking about what ontological mathematics is. I assume you already know it. Since this website is just going to be out there and I'm not going to advertise it or anything, and it's up to you to find it. If you somehow find this video, you're looking for ontological mathematics stuff. So you found it, so you know what ontological math is. And it saves me a lot of time because I did a few trial runs before, and you want to put in a couple slides about what is ontological mathematics, and it's just really hard to do in 5 minutes. But I am talking about the Pythagorean Illuminism. This would be the works from Mike Hockney, the God series, and the Truth series. And who am I? I'm just someone who's read a lot of the books and finds it very interesting. And there's very little out there, aside from videos from Morg and so forth. There's really not that much out there, and I just decided, hey, why don't I try to do something? So, but my attitude on it is like George Box, who's a system philosopher. All models are wrong, but some are useful. So I consider it to be a very useful model. As to its actual truth, I mean, most likely it's probably not right. But that doesn't mean it's not useful. And the other thing, I guess I should say, I am not associated with these guys or anything. I'm not part of any secret society. I'm just an ordinary guy out there. I have a background in engineering and software. So basically what we're going to do here is explore the metaphor between ontological math, or OM, and Linux, but this is not primarily going to be about Linux or computer science. So my target audience is people who've read the ontological math books and not computer science guys. So it's not going to, it's really, so don't be thrown if, this talk about Linux distributions. You really don't have to know that much about Linux distributions, but just get the basic idea. Okay, so we'll start looking at what a Linux distribution is by what I mean. Okay, so basically it's a collection, a curated and unified aggregation of applications, utilities, systems, tools to provide a complete and consistent user environment using common libraries that all seem to be cohesive and work together and doesn't seem is integrated. Some of the other, so the main components are the kernel, the shell, and the graphical interface. And also another thing that they need to provide are very powerful installers just to get the whole package installed. If if it's not easy to use, the actual installers for Windows are actually really not that good, because most people, when they get Windows, it's on the PC it comes with. So the only person who has to install it is the person working at Dell or whoever. But for Linux itself, people usually install it, so it has to be a powerful installer. And then also, they have very powerful package management systems to enforce consistency. So here's sort of maybe, you have sort of the kernel, which is the low-level system, and then you kind of have a system, either, back in the old days, it used to be the shell, but nowadays it's more of the graphical user interface. And really, most of it is going to be in the apps. This is just enabling technology, and so you can sort of roughly think of it as something like a hamburger. The meat is maybe the kernel, and the bun is the graphical interface or something, and all the different toppings. So, just like it's a mixture of things. So just like a hamburger, you might have a really well cooked patty, but if you're putting on some horrible tasting mustard or the bun isn't very good, it can destroy it. And you can also take maybe a patty that isn't very well cooked, but if you put on lots of good toppings, you can sort of, make it good that way. So what is ontological mathematics? So this sort of screen is meant to sort of basically parallel this other screen here. So if a Linux is a curated and unified aggregation of software technologies, ontological math is a system of curated and of philosophy, metaphysics, mathematics, and politics in order to provide a complete and consistent model of reality. Um, so the main components are the kernel, the shell, and the GUI. In the case of ontological math, it's the principle of sufficient reason, Euler's equation, and the monad. So you need powerful installers, and in the case of ontological math, they provide a comprehensive series of well-written books. And this is, to get people to understand it. And this is, as someone who's never really read philosophy, these books really got me interested, and they're just really well written and not dry or anything. And then with regards to the package management system, sort of the equivalent of that is they use, a system of deductive and rational methodology to enforce consistency. So that's sort of like, that's kind of the big analogy of how they sort of tie up. So before we start getting more into it, it may seem like that's not big of a deal. How big of a deal is it for your Linux distribution? It seems sort of easy to do. Like you just get a bunch of software together, and but it's not. It's really important. The GNU system was in development for 10 years, and when the kernel came along, the part written by Linus Torvalds, it was finally complete. But even after 10 years of development, and just to get to that's the first level, that took a long time. But it wasn't usable by most people because it was just way too hard. You have the situations where you have all these different utilities, and they're written. So you have something called glibc, which is a shared library. And if you have a piece of software that's compiled against glibc version 2.0 and another that's using glibc version 3.0, that's not going to work because you have a system that just has one version of this common library. So you have to make sure all the code is compiled to the same version, and you might have a program that is compiled for version 2, and when you go to compile against version 3 of glib, it doesn't work anymore. So you have to fix all that. You have to fix, and you have to decide between there might be a really good piece of application software out there that is really good, but it's very unstable. So you have to maybe fix it. And there's also tons of choice out there. There's 20 different text editors out there easily, and you have to decide among them, and it's just overwhelming for most people. So you want someone who works with this stuff a lot to come in there and do the curation. So, basically, it's a really important thing. You have the curation and a lot of fixing, making stuff that isn't written so well work, or you might when you recompile it. So basically you're bringing order to chaos. Okay, so let's now look at some other aspects of a Linux distribution and possibly how they're different from ontological mathematics. First of all, one of the things, there's almost 600 Linux distributions. I think, as we all know, there's really only like maybe 5 or 6 sort of major ones, but there's all sorts of variants. You know, people get into these religious wars over they like, there's two major graphical interfaces. There's GNOME, there's KDE. Some people like KDE, some people like GNOME. Some people even think some distributions allow for non-free software, and others are very strict and rigid. So it's almost kind of a religious thing. So people also just it's running on from the smallest handheld phone or embedded device up to like mainframe. So obviously you need certain characteristics. So there's a need to have a lot of different distributions. They generally contain almost free, almost entirely free and open source software that's created by a community of individuals that they are openly encouraged to make improvements. So you're actively will gladly take fixes from anybody. Um, and there's no, while some distributions have more influence and prestige than others, there's no one central authority. But one thing important to keep in mind, though, even though there's no one central authority, I think most people regard all Linux as sort of being more or less basically the same thing. They don't really regard Red Hat Linux to be different than Mint Linux. I mean, they sort of all have this, they're considered to be the same class. So, but there's no one saying, the closest is probably Debian or Red Hat, probably the two bigger, have the most pull. But and then the fourth is, while a distribution aims for completeness, there's nothing prohibiting from replacing or installing additional packages. So the first thing I do when I get a Linux distribution is most of them don't go into the programming tools. And since I'm a programmer, I like to load in my tools, and if they don't, certain packages they have I don't like, I'll use something else. Or there's also a lot of times there's packages that they have on there that I just don't use. I don't maybe uninstall them, but so in short, Linux distributions are free and open source. So let's sort of take a look at this other aspect of ontological mathematics, and I say it's perceived. So this is what I thought when I first wrote it up, when I was contrasting them. So you sort of have only one canonical source, which is the Pythagorean Illuminati. And up until recently, it was only known there's only about 6,000 members in the society. So its evolution and usage is tightly controlled and enforced by the society. Sort of once again, there's only one central authority, and they maintain that the system's absolutely complete, consistent, accurate, and have very little tolerance for alternate interpretations, additions, substitutions, or tweaks. And they even wrote an entire book on this. I can't remember the name of it now, the Troll series or something like that. And they absolutely savage these guys. I don't know exactly what they did, but I won't get in. I'm not going to wade into that. But so in other words, it's basically sort of like closed source as far as they're concerned, or sort of somewhat more like Windows. But then as I thought about it a little bit more, if you stop to think about it, one of the things that you have to realize is most of the ideas don't come directly from them. I mean, they're an aggregator, and like any distribution, I mean, Red Hat didn't write almost all of the software, but they're just bringing stuff together. But even the central things of ontological math, such as is basically sort of derived from a lot of it's influenced by Plato. I mean, you have the Fourier transforms, the monadology. That's all sort of, I guess you could say, off the shelf philosophy, and they sort of combined it all together and made it stick together. And I'm not taking away from them at all in that. That's a very big step, but so there's only sort of it's the things at the kernel. They have the concept of flowing points and etc. So 90% of ontological math doesn't even quote belong to them. So in other words, they're actually free and open source mostly. So even on this regard, they're actually a lot more like Linux distributions. Okay, so now that we've established, hopefully, that you can make an interesting comparison between Linux distributions and ontological maths. Just whether or not maybe you don't agree or whatever, but once you sort of, for me, it really helped me because when I was trying to understand, I was starting to get into ontological mathematics, and I mean, one of the things is you don't. I mean, there's no public figures, I guess, other than Moore. But when I was first getting into it, there wasn't even that. I mean, Mike Hockney, Thomas Stark. I mean, these are pseudonyms. And who are the people who wrote this? Who are these people? I mean, well, like, they're in, you go onto the web and you look for, Illuminati, you're going to find all sorts of weird stuff, which these guys aren't. So you kind of have to just form your own opinion just on what's there, not based on other people. So this is when, it helped me to sort of understand and appreciate exactly what ontological math is once I sort of drew this analogy and I realized, for instance, you know, it's like you don't have to accept everything because some of the things I didn't like I'll say I don't like I'm not a big fan of meritocracy. I maybe the intent of it is good, but I just think the implementation of it would lead to it's basically socialism, if you ask me, and it'd be very sort of a fascist type of socialism. But that's just my opinion. And you don't have to, just like a Linux distribution, you can take the parts you like and you can substitute things that you like instead. And even if they're way off on one thing, you can reject that one part of it. So anyways, so once you make the basic analogy, so you can just, here's some sort of fun things, you can sort of, it's just something did I wrote a little entry on my blog post. Here's some of this kind of stuff I come up with. Like, here's how you can think of, like the kernel of ontological math is obviously the monads and the principal sufficient region, and the duality between 0 and infinity. And then here's some essential system utilities. It doesn't really matter. This is just kind of the fun thing. As I said, the adware is meritocracy, which I don't like. But the analogy down here is it's a turkey burger, not in the sense that it's like a turkey. Like it's a turkey burger is a standard hamburger, but with a type of meat in it, you know, that is sort of spiced up to taste like beef. It's in other words, just sort of it's kind of just a slight variation on some other ideas. But maybe one more sort of, that's all nice and wonderful, but this is sort of more of a critical perspective here, drawing the analogy closer of them as being a closed source, and the fallout of this tight control. To me, it's leading to a lack of uptake, and they've done it twice where they had their two biggest groups of users or the biggest supporters recently. I mean, there's the original three guys, and then now there's a guy, I don't want to mention anyone's names, but there's a guy who I really liked out there, and he had a lot of good tutorials, and apparently it appears to me he's been exiled, so to speak. And I think the analogy I would give is they're Venn diagramming themselves out of existence. And I think one of the, if they really took, and they're free to do whatever they want to do, but if you take the Linux distribution analogy to heart, I would think one of the first forks would be to drop meritocracy from it. To me, you're alienating half your audience with that. I mean, and to me, the meritocracy doesn't mathematically follow. Like I can buy into they say all these other properties of flowing points and stuff is sort of mathematically, kind of loosely mathematically, more of an intuitively mathematics, but it's sort of a deductive, it's all a deduction, but to me, to say that meritocracy is like mathematically deduced from their base system isn't just right, is wrong, I mean. And it's just an opinion, or they just are, a left-leaning type of people, and that just appeals to them, So, so anyways, and the second distribution would be someone would add libertarianism, which is my inclination. um, and then the other thing I have, let's see, the wrong metaphor. Yeah, this whole concept, first of all, of thinking of it as a religion and everyone has to conform to this sort of like the equivalent of Catholicism. To me, that's ESF stands for extroverted sensing feeling, as opposed to the introverted intuitive thinking. I mean, high IQ, um, introverted intuitive thinkers are like cats, and they're not going to conform to everyone's at that who's like a smart INT. Um, is going to have their own system, and they're just not going to conform. Um, so, so let's look at this a little bit more in detail. So here's some stuff I got off the web. And once again, since I'm assuming you're sort of familiar with ontological math, I think everyone knows that this is one of the best things about it. Is I got a lot out of it. Is they really bring forth all these different personality types, and that explains a lot. And it was very insightful for me to learn all this and really think about. I mean, it really revolutionized the way I think about certain things. So as they say in their books, like they're the quote religion for INTs. So so if you look at the various clans, the two inner modes of the Myers-Briggs personality type, you know, you have an intuitive thinking. Okay, the other sort of components, like whether you're introverted or extroverted, or whether you're judging or perceiving, are kind of just slight variations, but these are sort of the nucleus traits. So here's how you can break everyone down. And the NT are the rational people. Now, as a percentage of the population, I got this off the web, or someone got this off the web somewhere. You know, is 10%. And look at SF. Like this is where traditional religion is. Like they're 4 times more represented. And when you look specifically at, for instance, the INTs, we're looking around here around 2% of the population, whereas ESFs, which are the big ones, the ESF here, I mean, well, they're 12.3%. ESFs are 20% alone. So we're talking about already a small enough population, and when you start with this is supposed to be sort of a Venn diagram. When you start with the INTs, and then basically the only people who are going to be attracted to this system are the high, people with IQs at least above 100. And then you want the guys who are non-woo, the love and light brigades. You don't want them. And then if you're going to add in the meritocracy, if you want people to accept your package in toto, then this would be their ideal candidate. Well, each one of these Venn diagrams is roughly, this right here is 10% of the population. Each one of these is a half, so high IQ is half, non-woo is probably half, and then of course the nation is roughly, 50% liberal, 50% conservative, so half. So you're taking 10%, and a half times a half times a half is an eighth. So that's close to 1/10. So you're taking 10% of 10%. So you're down to sort of 1% of the population. So you can't be so you're going to really, they're trying to get more people, and some of these if you're going to be really tightly rigid on what you allow people to believe or not believe, or what the characteristics are, there's not going to be too many people left. Okay, so I'm trying to I don't want to make this too long. My goal isn't really to get into all the different ways and all the different analogies, and this, it just is hopefully can stimulate some of your own thinking. But my main point is that there's a lot of parallels with Linux distributions with ontological math. And I personally think it should be okay to people to create their own slight, distributions. And I can almost anticipate what they'll say. They'll say this is what happened to Protestantism, and to a certain extent, I guess that's true because the Protestants don't have a central authority like the Pope. But I mean, all I can say on that is like this is just an internet philosophy. I mean, this isn't a religion, and I just don't know if that's just too grand a scheme to me. It doesn't. I just don't think it's applicable. This is one thing that, well, this is, okay, realize that most of ontological math is basically standard philosophy. That's one thing that helped me. It's nothing to be scared about. When you're starting to get into ontological math, it's like, are these guys devil worshippers or what? You, you know, they're actually, you could say they actually are Luciferian, but Luciferian is not in the way that you think it means. Once you understand it, it um, doesn't mean what most people would think it means. But it just helped me realize that a lot of it is just standard philosophy, and that's one of the things I really like about having the God series is that I learned a lot just about. I never even heard of Kant before, and all of these ideas. And as just sort of a practical matter, um, if you allow for people to create sort of their minor variations on ontological math, you could potentially increase the community size. And once again, most people, in the case of Linux distributions, I mean, most people consider Linux still to be a single unified thing. So I think it's certainly possible to do that in such a way that it wouldn't destroy the overall cohesiveness of ontological math. So, but that's all I have to say. And thank you for listening.